In the midst of World War II, the United States passed an order that would haunt its people and government for decades. After Pearl Harbor, the government declared war on Japan, passing Executive Order 9066, ordering the internment of Japanese Americans. A brave Japanese American named Fred Korematsu went against those orders. He filed a court case claiming the government never upheld their responsibility to uphold the Japanese Americans' right to due process and lost the case. 40 years later, the case was reopened coram nobis, and they overturned the original ruling, acknowledging the government's irresponsibility in protecting Americans' rights. The Korematsu vs. U.S. case was a pivotal case in shifting the court's perspective on judging cases involving racial minority groups, and continues to stand as a model of the unjust cost of civil liberties for so-called national security. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there was a massive uptick in racial discrimination and judgment towards the Japanese due to fear and mania throughout the country.
But no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
In the wake of this devastating event, President Franklin Roosevelt faced pressure to protect the United States and its citizens from further attacks. On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt passed Executive Order 9066. Japanese Americans were suddenly thrown into a dystopian society. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to internment camps all over America. Flourishing businesses and towns were abandoned and lives were destroyed. Families were ripped apart. They received no compensation, and questions like how long they were staying and what would happen to their property were left unanswered. They were completely isolated from society, dehumanizing them and breaking their spirits. Most of these Japanese Americans weren't even in Hawaii, where Pearl Harbor was. Many came from San Francisco and the rest of the West Coast.
Was there some justification? There was, but it was very thin. There were a submarine attack in Santa Barbara. There was a Japanese balloon from Japan that carried explosives, but those alone were isolated and not repeated incidents. So Hawaii had the largest population of Japanese Americans percentage-wise in the entire country. Why weren't they taken away? And so that kind of refutes any notion that there was the kind of danger on the West Coast that would allow or permit or justify the mass exclusion and imprisonment. Why weren't the Hawaii Japanese taken away en masse? And you can't answer that question without pointing the finger toward racism.
Despite there being no proof of threat, Japanese families were viewed as such because of their ancestry, an undeniable violation of American rights.
Kiwis out of the backwaters of the relocation centers into the mainstream of American life, so their labor can help to win the war, so the cost to the taxpayers may be reduced, so there can be no question of the constitutionality of any part of the action taken by the government to meet the dangers of war.
The government argued that any protest against the constitutionality of the act was null because the camps were mutually beneficial. The Japanese Americans in these concentration camps were supporting the war effort and the country, and the Americans were protected from potential Japanese threats. Some brave Americans stepped out to protest, garnering public attention. One of these people was Fred Korematsu. Korematsu grew up in the United States. He had never been too in touch with his Japanese heritage. When the exclusion order was announced, he felt he wasn't being treated like the American citizen he was.
No, I wasn't, because I didn't feel that I did anything wrong.
Korematsu made an effort to resist the exclusion order. He forged his identification, undergoing cosmetic surgery to pass as Spanish Hawaiian. However, on May 30th, 1942, Korematsu was caught and arrested by the FBI. In prison, Korematsu was met by Ernest Besig, the director of the American Civil Liberties Union. He wanted to help Korematsu fight his arrest and also identify the injustices in the U.S. government. Besig was able to submit a complaint to the War Relocation Authority after observing abuse in a major internment camp, who then quietly released those in prison to avoid uprisings from other camps.
Citizens couldn't be forced out of the community or placed into detention camps of any kind.
However, efforts to bring justice to Japanese Americans seemed to be working. Starting October 1942, if someone in an internment camp showed proof of employment away from the West Coast and passed the loyalty questionnaire, they were allowed to leave.
One of the phrases was, will you forswear allegiance to the Emperor of Japan? And something that we had never sworn allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. How can we forswear something we had never sworn to before? So
Korematsu filled the questionnaire proving his loyalty, and 2 years later, he was granted his leave. However, that wouldn't be the last of Korematsu. His lawyers still wanted to bring justice to the thousands of other Japanese Americans who were unfairly forced into internment camps. On October 11, 1944, the Supreme Court heard Korematsu's case. On December 18th that same year, the Supreme Court ruled that Korematsu's arrest was just and upheld the executive order.
Strong remain strong only if they exercise their strength. So, we exercise our strength.
After the verdict was passed, Korematsu was seen as a social outcast by other Japanese Americans because he was ruining the public perception of them. Other Asian populations were targeted as well. Vinci Chin, a Chinese draftsman who lived in Detroit, Michigan, was murdered by 2 men, allegedly because they thought he was Japanese. The Korematsu case soon lost its prevalence and began to fade away into the background. However, 37 years later, a group of lawyers felt the case never got its rightful ending. Almost 40 years after the final decision was delivered, Korematsu received a phone call from Peter Irons, an American attorney and civil rights activist. While reinvestigating the case, researchers had found the government was falsifying the record on military necessity. When the Korematsu vs. U.S. case was first brought up and being investigated, U.S. Solicitor General Charles Fay claimed all U.S. government and military assessments were in favor of Japanese internment. In the reopening of the case, Irons referred the case to Dale Manami, an attorney interested in seeking justice for the Japanese Americans. Irons, along with Manami, worked together to recruit other attorneys and researchers to fight for the various causes in the name of civil rights. One of these researchers was Aiko Yoshinaga. In 1981, she uncovered the Munson Report from 1941. The Munson Report was an intelligence report on the investigation of the danger of Japanese Americans requested by the U.S. The report's conclusions indicated that the Japanese Americans were of no threat to the U.S. government, clearly invalidating the government's justification that the Japanese Americans were a potential threat to national security. Following the Munson Report, in 1942, Kenneth Ringel, an Office of Naval Intelligence officer, led his own investigation on Japanese Americans on the West Coast. His report, named the Ringel Report, vouched for the loyalty of Japanese Americans and argued against their internment. However, many military generals, such as General John DeWitt, dismissed Ringel's report, making explicitly racist remarks. The government intentionally suppressed and destroyed evidence from the government intelligence agencies, violating the Fourth Amendment by unjustly jailing Japanese Americans. With new light being shed on the case, they began to see Korematsu and his case differently. Were these Americans truly wronged by the U.S. government? On February 19, 1976, President Gerald R. Ford signed a proclamation that officially terminated Executive Order 9066. On November 10, 1983, in the same courthouse where Korematsu was initially convicted, Federal Judge Marilyn Hall Patel overturned Korematsu's conviction. Additionally, the pro bono case led to the passing of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, where the government admitted Japanese Americans were wrongly interned by the United States, stating that the law was to discourage the occurrence of similar injustices and violations of civil liberties in the future. Today, decades after World War II, the impact of internment camps on Japanese Americans remained prevalent. While many Japanese Americans received compensation for their placement in the internment camps during World War II, no amount of money can compensate for the evident violation of rights and lives lost. However, after the Korematsu vs. U.S. case, representation of the minority groups in the courtroom have been carefully scrutinized. There are still minority groups that face discrimination from the U.S. government. Despite being able to prove their citizenship, many natural-born citizens from certain minority groups have been denied passports, violating the 15th Amendment. The Korematsu vs. U.S. case serves as a model for the violation of an individual's constitutional rights and the government's failure to uphold them. However, there is still a great amount of progress to be made in the U.S. by the government in easing racial biases and upholding the government's responsibility to protect the natural rights of all U.S. citizens.